There is something about America in the 1970s that people who lived through it cannot forget. The shag carpeting, the muscle cars turned economy cars, the way everything seemed to be changing all at once. If someone grew up then, they know exactly what made that decade so turbulent and unforgettable. This was a time when America was questioning everything it had believed about itself. The Vietnam War was finally ending. Watergate shattered trust in government. The economy was struggling with something economists had called impossible, inflation and stagnation at the same time. This was the decade that gave us disco and punk rock, Star Wars and Saturday Night Fever, the end of the draft and the beginning of the personal computer. The post-war optimism of the 1950s and the 1960s was over. America was figuring out what came next. Living through the 1970s meant experiencing a nation in transition. The certainty was gone. The future felt uncertain, but Americans were adapting, finding new ways forward. Let's walk through what daily life actually felt like during that complicated decade. Some of this might bring back memories. Some of it might explain why the 1970s felt so different from what came before. Let's step into that world. Homes in America in the 1970s had a look that anyone who lived through it recognizes instantly. Earth tones dominated everything. Harvest gold, avocado green, and burnt orange were everywhere. The kitchen appliances came in these colors. The refrigerator was avocado green, the stove was harvest gold, the dishwasher matched. Walking into a 1970s kitchen meant being surrounded by browns, golds, and greens. Shag carpeting covered floors throughout the house. Thick, deep pile carpet in brown or orange, or sometimes a bold pattern. It was near impossible to vacuum properly. Crumbs and dirt disappeared into it, but it felt luxurious under bare feet. Wood paneling covered walls, especially in basements and family rooms. Dark wood grain, usually fake, created that distinctive 1970s den aesthetic. Macrame plant holders hung from ceilings. Spider plants and ferns filled every available space. Homes felt like jungles. The combination of brown paneling, orange carpet, and abundant greenery defined the decade. Furniture was low and blocky. Sectional sofas in earth tones. Glass coffee tables. Beanbag chairs in dens and kids' rooms. Everything had an angular geometric quality. The formal living room, which families had maintained in the 1950s and 1960s, was disappearing. The family room became the heart of the home. This was where the television lived, where families gathered. Fondue sets appeared at every wedding. Dinner parties meant fondue, either cheese or chocolate. Crockpots were revolutionary for families where both parents worked. Put ingredients in before leaving in the morning and come home to a fully cooked meal. The concept seemed almost miraculous. American cars in the 1970s went through a dramatic transformation. At the start of the decade, cars were still huge. Enormous sedans and station wagons had engines that guzzled gas. Nobody worried about fuel efficiency. Gas was cheap. Then, the 1973 oil crisis changed everything overnight. OPEC embargoed oil shipments to America because of support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Gas prices quadrupled. Lines at gas stations stretched for blocks. People waited for hours just to fill their tanks. Some states implemented rationing based on license plate numbers. Odd numbers could buy gas on certain days, even numbers on others. The crisis hit Americans hard because the entire country was built around cheap gas and big cars. Suburbs sprawled far from city centers. Public transportation was limited. People needed cars for everything. Suburbs had been designed for the automobile. The American automotive industry scrambled to respond. Smaller cars started appearing, like the Ford Pinto and the Chevrolet Vega. These cars were designed to compete with Japanese imports such as Toyota and Datsun, which were suddenly popular because they were fuel efficient. Smaller cars became the trend, but those American small cars had problems. The Pinto became infamous for exploding in rear-end collisions. Quality control was poor. Meanwhile, Japanese cars were reliable and efficient. American car companies lost market share they would never fully recover. The muscle car era ended abruptly. Those big V8 engines that defined the late 1960s became impractical. Performance cars disappeared from showrooms. The cars that did remain had emissions controls that reduced horsepower. A Corvette in 1975 had less power than a decade earlier. Muscle cars were no longer the same. Station wagons remained popular for families. The wood-paneled station wagon with the rear-facing third seat was everywhere. Kids fought over who got to sit in the back, waving at cars behind them. There were no seatbelts in the back. Children rolled around freely. There were no car seats for young kids. Babies often rode in their mother's arms. Station wagons dominated family road life. Television in the 1970s was where American families gathered each evening. Most homes had one television set. It was a large piece of furniture with fake wood grains sitting prominently in the family room. Family. There were three major networks: ABC, CBS, and NBC. Maybe a PBS station. A few independent stations in bigger cities. That was it. No cable for most Americans until the late 1970s. Networks. Changing channels meant getting up and turning a dial. Remote controls were rare and expensive. The TV guide was essential. It listed every show for the week, so families planned their viewing. Miss a show, and you usually missed it entirely unless it returned as a summer rerun. Essential television programming reflected American culture, and it helped push culture forward. All in the Family debuted in 1971, and it changed television. Archie Bunker was a bigot, and the show confronted racism, sexism, and political divisions. Nothing like it had been on American television. Changed. The Mary Tyler Moore Show depicted an independent career woman. Mary Richards was single, working, and living her own life. This was revolutionary for the time. Revolutionary MASH started in 1972 as a comedy set during the Korean War, but it was really about Vietnam. The show dealt with war, death, and trauma while still being funny. MASH Happy Days premiered in 1974 and created nostalgia for the 1950s. America wanted to remember a simpler time. The Fonz became a cultural icon. Nostalgia. Saturday Night Live launched in 1975 and brought counterculture comedy to network television. The show was edgy, irreverent, and political. It felt dangerous. The original not ready for primetime players became stars. Edgy Roots aired in 1977, and 130 million Americans watched. The miniseries about slavery and its aftermath forced conversations about race and American history. The finale remains one of the most watched broadcasts in American history. Roots. Before we continue with the music and culture that defined this era, if you are enjoying this look back at how Americans really lived and want to explore more decades and places, please consider subscribing. There are so many more stories about how life was actually lived in the years that shaped America. There is always more history to uncover. Music in the 1970s in America was incredibly diverse, reflecting a country that could not agree on much of anything. Rock fractured into dozens of subgenres. Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd represented progressive rock. The Eagles and Fleetwood Mac created the smooth California sound. Bruce Springsteen emerged as the voice of working-class America with Born to Run in 1975. Disco exploded in the mid-1970s. Saturday Night Fever in 1977 made disco mainstream. The Bee Gees dominated the charts. Disco clubs opened across America. Studio 54 in New York became legendary. Disco was about excess, glamour, and dancing all night. It was also about liberation for gay Americans and for communities of color where disco originated. Punk rock emerged as a reaction against disco and corporate rock. In New York, bands like the Ramones, Television, and Patti Smith led the scene. The raw, stripped-down sound was a deliberate rejection of polish and production. Punk was about anger and authenticity. Motown was fading but still producing hits. Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, and Diana Ross continued creating incredible music. Soul and funk evolved with artists like Earth, Wind and Fire and Parliament Funkadelic. Country music had crossover stars. Dolly Parton, Willie Nelson, and Waylon Jennings brought country to mainstream audiences. The outlaw country movement rejected Nashville's polish for something rawer. Record stores were cultural centers. Teenagers would spend hours flipping through albums, studying cover art. Buying an album was an event. People would take it home, carefully remove the shrink wrap, place it on the turntable, and read the liner notes while listening all the way through. 8-track tapes in cars meant music on the road. By the late 1970s, cassette tapes were taking over with better sound and the ability to record mixtapes. The economy in the 1970s was struggling in ways that confused economists. Inflation and unemployment were both high at the same time. This was not supposed to happen. Economists called it stagflation. Prices kept rising. In 1973, inflation was over 8%. By 1980, it reached 13.5%. Wages could not keep up. $1 in 1970 was worth 50 cents by 1980. Everything cost more: gas, groceries, housing. Americans felt like they were working harder and falling behind. The manufacturing jobs that had built the middle class were disappearing. Factories closed. Steel mills shut down. American companies could not compete with cheaper foreign products. The Rust Belt was born as industrial cities declined. Unemployment rose, especially during the recessions from 1973 to 1975 and in 1980. The guaranteed prosperity of the post-war decades was over. For the first time, Americans worried their children might not do better than they had. The stock market went nowhere for the entire decade. Investing felt pointless. Real estate struggled in many areas. The future looked uncertain. Major events shaped American consciousness throughout the 1970s. The Vietnam War finally ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon. Images of helicopters evacuating the American embassy were seared into memory. America had lost. The confidence that had defined American foreign policy since World War II was shattered. Watergate unfolded from 1972 to 1974. The scandal started with a break-in at Democratic headquarters. It ended with President Nixon resigning in disgrace. Americans watched the hearings on television. Trust in government collapsed. Cynicism became the default attitude toward politics. The bicentennial in 1976 gave America a moment of celebration and reflection. It was 200 years since independence. Tall ships sailed into New York Harbor. Fireworks exploded across the country. For a moment, Americans remembered what they were celebrating. The Iran hostage crisis began in 1979 when Iranian revolutionaries seized the American embassy in Tehran and held 52 Americans hostage. Every night, news broadcasts counted the days. America felt helpless. The crisis dragged on for 444 days. National confidence, already shaken, sank lower. Childhood in the 1970s in America meant a kind of freedom that seems unimaginable now. Kids left the house in the morning and came home when the streetlights came on. Parents often did not know where they were. Neighborhoods were full of children playing outside. Kids rode bikes everywhere without helmets. They built forts in the woods and played elaborate games that lasted all day. Organized activities were rare. Sports meant neighborhood kids gathering at a park and playing pickup games. No coaches, no uniforms, no parents watching. Television was still the babysitter on Saturday mornings. Cartoons ran from 7 in the morning until noon. Scooby-Doo, Super Friends, Looney Tunes. Kids watched while eating sugary cereal. Toys were simpler but obsessively treasured. Hot Wheels tracks covered basement floors. Barbie had an entire universe of accessories. G.I. Joe with Kung Fu grip. The Evel Knievel stunt cycle. Board games brought families together. Monopoly games lasted for days. Clue, Stratego, Risk. Playing usually meant sitting around a table, no screens. Playground equipment was dangerous by today's standards. Metal slides that burned in summer. Tall swings. Merry-go-rounds that spun dangerously fast. Kids got hurt regularly. Nobody sued. It was accepted as part of childhood. What defined America in the 1970s was uncertainty and transition. The post-war consensus had shattered. The economy was struggling. Trust in institutions collapsed. The war was lost. The president resigned. Energy was expensive. The future felt unclear, but Americans adapted. New music emerged. New technologies appeared, new ways of thinking developed. The environmental movement gained strength. The women's movement advanced. Gay rights activism began. America was becoming more diverse, more questioning, more complex. For those who lived through the 1970s, it was a decade of brown and orange, of waiting in gas lines, of Watergate hearings, of disco balls and punk shows. It was a time when America lost its innocence, but gained something more honest. The 1970s were messy and complicated, just like America itself. For those with memories of this transformative decade, there is always more history to explore.